series, and enjoyed the art and process of teaching again after a couple of years of retirement and not doing this. This has been most enjoyable for me, and hopefully I'll do it again before too long, maybe next fall, although not on Kierkegaard. First, a remark about what you have in your seats. There are 3 handouts. You can take them with you today. This is the last period, so yeah, we're not going to need them again. So if you want a souvenir, or if you want some texts to read, the texts for today are going to be, I think, really relevant to the season we're in. But in any case, you have a handout that has on the one side the 3 stages of existence. We're going to review that in just a moment, and then reduplication on the other side. We're going to review that, 2 important topics of relevance to what we were dealing with last time and also this time. You also have a strange little thing called the absolute paradox. What does it look like? Just file that away. We may or may not get to that. That's going to be something like a responsive reading, but we'll get to that if we do. And then you have the outline for today with texts attached. So that you have on the front sheet of that and the back sheet all of the topics remaining. We may not get to all of them, whatever, but there they are. And then you have the texts that we're going to read together today from Kierkegaard's authorship. So keep that handy particularly because that's going to be useful for you and also for me. So the first thing I'd like to do is just review 2 important Kierkegaardian categories, 2 important items in the Kierkegaard lexicon from the last 2 times. One is Kierkegaard's famous motif of the 3 stages of existence, or the 3 spheres of existence, as he variously calls it. And if you recall, this is not a developmental psychology. It's really 3 lifestyles, 3 ways a person can structure their existence, 3 ways the narrative of a person's life can be shaped. And each one responds to a question. The question would be, what is the focus of your life? If the focus of your life is enjoyment, you are living in the aesthetic stage or sphere. And there are many different kinds of enjoyments. So you have a lower and a higher version of aestheticism. The lower version is what Kierkegaard calls immediacy, associated in a later writing of Kierkegaard, The Sickness Unto Death, which we'll talk about if we get to the second phase of Kierkegaard's authorship today, the latter phase. He associates it with Philistinism, this kind of contented worldliness, going with the flow of one's passions and desires, not aspiring to anything higher than the immediate satisfactions of existence. But there's a higher form of aestheticism. We took a brief look at that last time. The first volume of Either Or, the first published work of Kierkegaard that put him on the map as a literary figure in Denmark, the first volume written by the anonymous aesthete A, so-called, represents a kind of poetized version of living for the immediate satisfactions of existence. By poetized, I mean, or Kierkegaard means, reflecting on the desires of the flesh. So that, famously, the author of Either Or Volume 1 writes this diary of a seducer who actually is more interested in the poetic imagination of seduction than the actual event. Talked about that a bit. So that's a kind of romantic poet existence, bohemian poet existence that was fairly common in the first part of the 19th century, and it's still, of course, an option that people can live in. Think of Byron or some of the early Romantic poets who lived a kind of lawless, amoral existence, but they were more interested in pursuing their aesthetic ideals than the lusts of the flesh. And then there is an existential leap across a huge chasm to ethical existence, or the ethical stage, ethical sphere. And that is, of course, a life of moral responsibility, having in the form of one's existence an aspiration to live responsibly. And that also has a lower and higher form. The lower form is represented by Either Or Volume 2. We talked about that last time as well. The sober, stern Judge William is offering his epistles of admonition to the aesthete from Volume 1, saying basically to get a life, marry, settle down, don't be profligate, have a family, be a good, responsible citizen, and so on. And Judge William is characterized in Volume 2 of Either Or as a judge in the lower courts. He's a judge assessor. So his mode of life is to live responsibly in and through his roles in civic society. Nothing wrong with that. But there's a higher form of ethical existence, according to Kierkegaard's structuring of his authorship. And that is a life of unconditional autonomy, as I put it here. Autonomy being a law unto one's self, pulling oneself up by one's ethical bootstraps above and beyond one's civic and familial roles. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through further titles in Kierkegaard's pseudonymous writings. And then finally you have religious existence. And again, there's a huge existential leap beyond the ethical and the aesthetic into the lower and higher reaches of the religious sphere. The lower form of religious existence is dubbed by the pseudonymous author Johannes Climacus the last of the important pseudonymous authors of Kierkegaard's first authorship. Keep all that in mind. We talked about that last time. The pseudonymity and indirect communication employed in Kierkegaard's first series of writings, the first authorship. The lower form is what he calls religion A, or the religion of immanence. And immanence means within the orbit of human subjectivity. And religion A is associated with Socrates and Plato, the ancient Greek philosophers, who sought the eternal good, eternal truth from within the reaches of their own souls, their own minds, and so on. And Kierkegaard would say that's a legitimate form of religious existence. It's a quest for God, ultimately, in the interiority of a person's subjective existence. But there's a higher form, and the higher form is religion B, as Johannes Climacus puts it, the religion of transcendence, and that, of course, is associated with Christianity, with God's revelation in Christ and historical revelation through the people of Israel, and so on. And there God is found, yes, interiorly, but more importantly in a historical revelation, in a historical person of Jesus Christ, who is external to the person's interior life and makes a claim upon that interior life. All right, those are the three stages, three spheres, just a brief review. And then turn the page, reduplication, which is extremely important for understanding everything we're going to talk about today. We talked about it last time. I said it was the key that unlocked most of the doors, or all of the doors, in Kierkegaard's authorship. And it's defined by Kierkegaard as the reflection of the content of a discourse back into its form. That's very technical. A better way, perhaps, of expressing it, perhaps a clearer way, would be Marshall McLuhan's famous phrase, "The medium is the message." So the form or the medium of the communication, whether it be a written communication, a work of art, or the communication inherent in a person's way of life, right? The content of that communication is reflected back into the medium. So as I have it here as an example, a poem on the Eucharist that is structured on the page in the shape of a chalice. I think there actually was such a poem. One of the English metaphysical poets of the 17th century did such a thing. But whether that's the case or not, you can see that the form of the poem reflects its content. If the content is about the Eucharist, the form in the shape of a chalice reflects that. And there are various dimensions of reduplication beyond the human authorial. There's the ethical, where the form of a person's life reflects the ethical content. And of course, if they're at variance, then you've got hypocrisy. And then there's the divine authorial, which we're going to get into rather deeply today if we manage to cover everything. And that's the content of God's self-communication lived out and concretely realized in the form of the suffering servant, Jesus Christ, right? The form of Jesus' existence is not accidental, but essential to the communication that God is addressing to the human condition through the mission of Christ. So just file all of that in the back of your mind, and we're going to now get back into the chronicle of Kierkegaard's life and writings. We talked quite a bit about his melancholy upbringing and how his father engaged in what we could say call spiritual abuse of his young son, and how Kierkegaard was so depressed in his early adulthood that he contemplated suicide and so on and so forth. But he eventually got over that through a serious religious conversion, and then had the tragic experience of a broken engagement with Regina Olsen, and all of that fed into his master plan of an authorship that had two halves. One would be the writings that didn't come out under his own name, but under the names of pseudonyms, who are not just alternate names for Kierkegaard, but fictitious authors expounding their own worldviews, which may or may not be consonant with Kierkegaard's own understandings and own beliefs. And then you have a whole series of what Kierkegaard called edifying discourses. They're kind of written out sermons. And while the pseudonymous writings were a cause célèbre in the literary circles of Denmark and earned Kierkegaard a huge amount of popularity, the edifying discourses, not so much. They basically remained obscure. And if you look at the edifying discourses which came out under his own name, you get a sense of what Kierkegaard was about over the long haul, what Kierkegaard was reduplicating over the long haul of his pseudonymous writings. All right, so we looked at either or last time, and I had mentioned not only that the anonymous aesthete and Judge William, the romantic poet who's trying to enjoy the immediate pleasures of life but can't do so because he's always caught up in poetic reflection. In Volume 1, Volume 2, Judge William admonishing the young man to settle down and become a responsible citizen. They could be two halves of the same person, two alter egos. And then you have that really strange conclusion to Volume 2, which is not by neither the aesthete nor Judge William. It's this sermonette on the topic of, as over against God, we are always in the wrong. It represents perhaps the religious stage or the first gambit in that direction in the pseudonymous authorship. And so the question is, where does the either or fall? There's great irony in that. Is the big chasm between living hedonistically or living responsibly? Or do those two line up as over against the higher calling of a religious existence? Well, of course, those questions are broached in the pseudonymous writings, in either or 1 and 2, but they're not answered. And that's the whole point of the pseudonymous writings. They are Socratic. They raise questions like Socrates of old did, but don't provide any definitive answers except looking over the whole long haul of the pseudonymous writings. Now I'm going to go on very briefly to say something about the next item on the list, and that is repetition. And the pseudonymous author here is Constantine Constantius. Notice the reduplication already there, right? It's a book about repetition, and I'll talk about repetition of what in a moment. And the pseudonymous author is the constant one, Constantine the constant one. Well, he's anything but constant, and there's the irony that subverts the reduplication. Irony and reduplication are the, as we said last time, the two sides of the same coin. One is the inverse of the other. If reduplication is the medium corresponds to the message, irony is the message subverts the medium. And what that repetition is about this sort of jaded, old, hedonistic aesthete, also probably belongs to that higher version of aesthetic existence, the higher form, along with the aesthete from Either Or Volume 1. He's a similar figure, although he's kind of older and more jaded and more, case-hardened in his pursuit of poetic pleasures. And he has a project. His project is to repeat exactly the thrill of an aesthetic experience he had in Berlin many years before. So he thinks he can, just by controlling the circumstances of another visit to the same theater, viewing the same play, having the same meal and the same drinks and so on, that whole experience can be repeated. What he discovers is, it's a disaster. It's a disaster. The old thrill won't come back. Pleasures can't be repeated exactly, and so on. And so repetition of enjoyment is something that is elusive. One can't get the joy back again. Here's a little footnote. That is an important theme in C.S. Lewis's spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, if anyone has ever read that. Lewis, as a young man, lived a somewhat poetical, aesthetic existence, and he had these experiences of rapturous joy, but he had a hard time repeating them. They would fly away, they would dissipate, and so on. And something similar is going on in repetition. But there's a deeper message in repetition, and that is the question of whether it's possible not just to repeat aesthetic pleasures or hedonic pleasure, but whether meaning can ever be repeated exactly. And this is why repetition of all of Kierkegaard's pseudonymous writings is, in some ways, the most important for recent philosophical hermeneutics, philosophical theories of language and interpretation. There's a movement, we can't go into it today, known as post-structuralism, whose main point is that linguistic signs which carry meaning are never static. They can never be repeated exactly, so that whenever this so-called same word or phrase or text is uttered in a second context or read in a second context, the meaning subtly shifts, so that the meaning is never stable over time. It's always shifting, changing, it's always involved in flux. And that seems to be the deeper theme of repetition, which, of course, means that Kierkegaard anticipated post-structuralist hermeneutics a century and a half before it became fashionable in philosophical circles and literary circles today. It's an amazingly prophetic, in that sense, work. All right, I want to move on now to the next item on the outline here.
There was a question back there.
Yes, please.
David, it's fascinating that there's a kind of aesthetic irony here, because within the context of the arts, repetition is a means by which we repeat a a series of notes to create a melody. We repeat a series of colors, lines, forms. That repetition becomes a kind of, lends itself to a structural unity, while at the same time improvisation and invention occurs within those repeated structures.
Right. Indeed.
So, kind of fascinating how there's a bit of a flip there in which the very aesthetic form, that original, that thing that we call the thing made, is can never be repeated. But
yes. Well, Kierkegaard's discourse actually undermines the whole distinction between an original and a copy. And that's one of the whole points of post-structuralism. What is the original text? Post-structuralism is the polar opposite of something that's been in the news, not infrequently recently, originalism. We can't get into constitutional law here and so on, but the idea that a text is always mobile and always changing in its meaning, and the distinction between the original and the duplicate or the repetition or whatever is always undermined. Now that may be a problematic notion, or it may not be, or whatever, but that's sort of the upshot of repetition. Now remember, Kierkegaard's pseudonyms don't necessarily represent Kierkegaard's own position on anything, but it raised Socratic questions which are sometimes troubling and unsettling and difficult, and there's one of them. All right, let's move on to the next one on the list here. One of Kierkegaard's most famous works. If you take a college course in philosophy that has a unit on Kierkegaard, chances are you'll read either something from Fear and Trembling or the whole of Fear and Trembling by John the Silent One, Johannes de Silentio. And basically it's an unsettling, deeply unsettling meditation on the Abraham-Isaac narrative from the Old Testament. And famously, Johannes de Silentio represents the kind of interstice between the higher form of ethical existence, the life of complete ethical autonomy, where one's highest ethical aspirations animate all of one's existence, and those ideals cannot be compromised or mediated through civic responsibilities and norms like Judge William wants to. There's something higher, a higher ethical calling of complete fidelity to a moral law that is the law of one's own being, a higher form of ethical existence. But what Johannes de Silentio is pondering is, but there's a higher form of existence beyond that, a religious existence which he cannot understand. It's absurd to him that there was a God who supposedly promised to this figure Abraham that his seed would be a blessing to all nations, and then called this person to sacrifice his own son in violation of the moral law. I mean, that's just deeply, deeply troubling. It violates ethicism. It violates the notion of ethical autonomy that Johannes de Silentio represents. But he's attracted as well as repulsed to the story of Abraham. He's sort of, again, in the gap, trying not to fall into the existential abyss between the higher form of ethical existence and religious existence as typified in the Abraham-Isaac story. And in this work, you get two of Kierkegaard's most famous, I should say Johannes de Silentio, because Kierkegaard may or may not be on the same page with his pseudonym. But you get two of the more famous motifs in Kierkegaard's authorship, we'll put it that way. The notion of a teleological suspension of the ethical. That's a long, complicated phrase that just means, are there situations in which a higher loyalty to God could suspend the ethical law, however we conceive that, suspend ethical responsibility for sake of a higher loyalty? Well, it seems that Abraham is very willing to suspend the ethical for the sake of his higher loyalty. Perhaps that's why, well, not perhaps, it is why Paul calls him the father of faith. And Johannes de Silentio is alive to that, but he can't make that leap of faith because to him that's absurd. there's a higher loyalty than the loyalty to the ethical law. And the other motif, which is very famous from this work, is the Knight of Faith, K-N-I-G-H-T, of faith. And the Knight of Faith is the person like Abraham whose faith is so strong, who believes in virtue of the absurd, as Johannes de Saletio puts it, that the miraculous will occur, that his son will be restored to him. So he goes out to Mount Moriah joyfully, knife in hand, because he believes that Yahweh will ultimately restore his son and not require him to go through with the sacrifice, and that indeed the original promise that through his loins all of the world will be blessed and so on, and that his progeny will be multiplied as the sands of the sea. He continues to believe in that promise. And again, that Johannes de Saletio can't understand that. But the idea of the Knight of Faith is precisely one who believes in the absurd restoration of loss. And Kierkegaard may well have had in mind here, this is a traditional interpretation of this motif in Fear and Trembling, that even though he forsook his relationship with Regina Olsen and broke the engagement, that somehow Regina Olsen would be restored to him as Isaac was restored to Abraham. And does Kierkegaard dare to be a knight of faith in that respect? Well, of course, that didn't happen, although, here's a little footnote, at the very end of Regina Olsen's life, she lived quite a bit longer than Kierkegaard. She married her old boyfriend, Schlegel, by the way, we talked about him last time. Schlegel was a functionary of the state, was appointed as governor of one of the Danish West Indies, and so she lived somewhere in the Caribbean with him for all of her life. But apparently she was interviewed by someone who knew about the broken engagement and so on, close to the end of her life as an old lady. And she confessed that to the end, she loved Kierkegaard. And she wished that they were able to be married. It's a sweet and tragic story. All right, as I said, this is days of our lives here, All right. Moving right along. Let's see, fear and trembling. The concept of anxiety, I'm not going to spend a long time expounding because we talked about it last time. It's by Vigilius Hoffniensis, the watchman of Copenhagen. And he represents further into the religious sphere. He's interested in the narrative of the fall from Genesis 3, and he's giving a kind of what we would call phenomenological interpretation in philosophical language, or psychological interpretation of Adam and Eve and the serpent and the fall into sin and so on. And if you recall, I mentioned last time as an example of literary reduplication, this passage, the passage in the concept of anxiety, where Vigilius Hoffniensis, I'm going to say Kierkegaard, is giving a psychological interpretation of the serpent. And in Danish, every other word begins with a sibilant, so that if you read it aloud, you're hissing like a serpent. So, that reduplicates the message. The message is each one of us is our own tempter, our own serpent. Enough on the concept of anxiety, because we need to spend a great deal of time, we don't have a huge amount of it, with the Climacéan writings, Johannes Climacus. And he represents, that pseudonym represents a kind of culmination of what's come to be known as the first authorship, 1842 to 1846. And I haven't even listed all the writings that, came about during that 4-year period. It's amazing authorship. All Kierkegaard did, he didn't have to work a job because he inherited his father's fortune, so he stood at his high desk morning, noon, and night, writing. And Kierkegaard thought, or what's the word I want here? Kierkegaard planned that the two Klimachéan writings that correspond to one another and belong together, philosophical fragments and the concluding unscientific postscript, would be the culmination of this authorial project, and that after that, Kierkegaard would lay down his pen and try something else, do something else. That didn't happen, by the way, and we may get a chance to talk about why later on. So the writings by Johannes Climacus are essential for understanding where the authorship was heading all along, and where it was heading all along, no surprise, is expounding the question of what does it mean to become a Christian. Go all the way back to our first presentation, right? The two big questions in Kierkegaard's authorship are, what does it mean to become a human being, an existing individual, and what does it mean to become a Christian? And that second question, the question of what does it mean to become a Christian, becomes explicit in the Klimachéan writings, as they're called. Climacus represents the religious stage of existence, but if you look at your little chart of the three stages, he represents the lower of the two stages. Now, the lower stage, I said, was representative of a kind of Socratic Platonic worldview. And in the Socratic Platonic worldview, there is eternal truth. There's something divine. And we discover the divine and we appropriate the divine through an inward path of contemplating eternal truth, accessing and contemplating eternal truth. And Kierkegaard affirms the legitimacy of that up to a point. And Johannes Climacus represents the furthest reaches of that Platonic Socratic religiosity, because he's contemplating another hypothesis, as he puts it. The other hypothesis is that the eternal essential truth has come into being in time and history. And what would that mean? What would that look like? Well, that would be a paradox, an absolute paradox, if the eternal truth somehow came into being in time, in the realm of becoming, in the realm of our changeable mortal existence. We'll talk more about that, which is the big theme in philosophical fragments. It also comes up in the concluding postscript as well. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. But first, more about the name Johannes Climacus. Johannes Climacus is the name of an actual historical person, a 7th century Eastern Orthodox monk and mystic who wrote and whose writings are considered authoritative, or at very least important in the history of Eastern Orthodox mysticism. You can read the writings of the actual Johannes Climacus. Now, Kierkegaard actually knew of the history of Christian mysticism by consulting an early work, early in the history of the scientific or historical study of religion, which just got its start during Kierkegaard's lifetime in Germany. So there was this author whose last name was Goethe, German author, who wrote one of the very first studies of Christian mysticism in its history. And Kierkegaard was very, very interested in the history of Christian mysticism by reading that book as a young man. And so he knew at least about the historical Johannes Climacus and much else besides in the history of both Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic mysticism. How much of an influence that was upon him and his thought is an interesting and open question which we can't get to today. But anyway, the importance of the name, though, goes beyond any correspondence with the historical Johannes Climacus. Or the name means John of the Ascent, A-S-C-E-N-T, John of the Stairs, John of the Ladder, and the motif of the ladder of ascent to God is rife in the history of Western mysticism. And you find it also in Neoplatonism, and of course, Johannes Climacus represents the more Platonic approach to God, to eternal truth, and all of that. So it all fits together. Johannes Climacus is climbing up on the stairs here, reaching up towards Christianity as a historical revelation of God, but not quite there. He's sort of like Moses viewing the promised land from afar. but viewing from afar gives you, sometimes a very good take on the big picture of what your viewing is all about. And Johannes Climacus has, I think, a very broad and deep understanding of this kind of religious existence that he hasn't yet been able to enter into. That would be religion B, as he calls it, the Christian religiosity. So, philosophical fragments and concluding postscript, there's an irony in these two Climacus works. The philosophical fragments is anything but fragmentary. It's the most rigorous, the most almost mathematical in its structure of all of Kierkegaard's writings. It's very short, and in its compass, it treats the following, and I'm just going to read from my notes here. The philosophical fragments explores the old Socratic question of whether eternal truth can be learned, and whether the moment in which the learner encounters the teacher is of decisive significance. So if the teacher is the Socratic teacher, the moment is not of significance because, as Socrates historical Socrates put it, I'm just an occasion for you to recollect the eternal from within yourself. So when Socrates encounters his interlocutors, the folks he questioned and entered into philosophical dialogue with, his role was simply to get the person to raise questions that led that person into the interiority of that person's soul and to access eternal truth by recollecting eternal truth innately within a person's mind. And in the philosophical fragments, Johannes Climacus is contrasting that Socratic idea with a hypothesis. He frames it as a hypothesis. What if the eternal truth, as I mentioned a moment ago, has come into being in time? In that case, the teacher, so-called, would be of very great importance, and the moment of encountering the historical revealer of the eternal God would be all important as well. Well, that's a hypothesis explored rigorously in the philosophical fragments. Now, the irony here is the concluding unscientific postscript to the philosophical fragments. It's also the postscript of the whole pseudonymous authorship by Johannes Climacus. You would think it's just a little, addendum to the philosophical fragments. But just as the philosophical fragments is anything but fragmentary, the postscript is this huge, hulking 400-page tome that is in itself fragmentary in its composition. So you have irony here rather than reduplication. However, there is a deep reduplication in the very title of philosophical fragments, which I can't get into, but is going to be hinted at least in some of the texts that we're going to read. And now we're going to read some texts because there are a couple of very important topics in our Kierkegaard lexicon that we never did get to. Leap of faith, paradox, and passion. So we're going to get to those today. We do have time for that, so take out your texts. And we're going to read On Faith from concluding unscientific postscript. Kierkegaard made famous this phrase, the leap of faith, an existential leap, a leap into uncertainty. And it'll become clear, I think, even though this is a very overwritten passage, Kierkegaard is sort of satirizing the ponderous Germanic professors that he knew. But anyway, that's an incidental issue. So when subjectivity is the truth, and we talked about that last time, read a passage about subjective truth, I can't go over that again. When subjectivity is the truth, the concept must include an expression for the antithesis to objectivity. This expression will also indicate the tension of the subjective inwardness. Now, inwardness here means, among other things, the existential passion of the individual confronted with, ultimately, religious claims, But it also refers, and this is the point to his phrase, subjective truth. When the issues are existential, having to do with your very being, issues having to do with, for instance, eternal life, salvation, whatever, those issues go to the heart of the matter and to the heart of the person. So inwardness, subjectivity here, doesn't refer to subjectivism. Kierkegaard's not a relativist or a subjectivist, as I mentioned in a previous session. What Kierkegaard is saying is there is a deeper kind of truth and a deeper kind of knowledge than mere intellectual assent, A-S-S-E-N-T. Important though that is, there's a deeper knowledge that comes from the spiritual center of the human person. That's what he means by inwardness. That's what he means by subjectivity. This expression will also indicate the tension of the subjective inwardness. Here is such a definition of subjective truth. An objective uncertainty held fast in an appropriation process of the most passionate inwardness is the truth, the highest truth attainable for the existing individual. At the point where the way swings off, and where this is cannot be specified objectively, since it is a matter of subjectivity, there, at that existential crossroads, objective knowledge is placed in abeyance. Thus, the subject merely has objectively the uncertainty. It is this which precisely increases the tension of the infinite passion which constitutes the inwardness, the effort of the heart to gain access to a truth higher and greater than that which has to do with mere objective certainty. The truth is precisely the venture, that's a wonderful word here that translators use, the venture, you can almost say adventure, which chooses an objective uncertainty, which is the passion of the infinite. We'll get to passion in a moment, what that means for Kierkegaard. I contemplate nature in the hope of finding God, and I see omnipotence and wisdom. But I also see much that disturbs my mind and excites anxiety. That was written before Darwin's theory of evolution became known. He would probably say it excites a great deal more anxiety knowing what we know about nature red in tooth and claw these days. The sum of all this is an objective uncertainty about how far we can infer God's existence from the order and purposiveness, so-called, of creation. But it is for this very reason that the inwardness or the interiority becomes as intense as it is, for it embraces this objective uncertainty, he's talking about the existence of God as creator here, with infinite passion. In the case of a mathematical proposition, the objectivity is given, but for this reason, the truth of the proposition is precisely a matter of subjective indifference. But the above definition of truth is an equivalent expression for faith. Without risk, there is no faith. So for Kierkegaard here, or for Johannes Climacus, and Kierkegaard agrees with Johannes Climacus on this point, a risk-free faith is a contradiction in terms. Faith is precisely the contradiction between the infinite passion of the individual's inwardness and the objective uncertainty. If I am capable of grasping God objectively, I do not believe. But precisely because I cannot do this, I must believe. If I wish to preserve myself in faith, I must certainly be intent on holding fast to the objective uncertainty, so that in the objective uncertainty, I am out upon 70,000 fathoms of water and yet believe. So this is a famous expression in Kierkegaard's authorship, faith as being out over 70,000 fathoms without a life raft or without a life jacket, and, swimming, trying to keep afloat. So religious faith, authentic religious faith, for Johannes Climacus anyway, is never absolutely certain. If it were, it wouldn't be faith, it would be knowledge. It would be knowledge. And so, Kierkegaard, through Climacus, is basically saying, whether one agrees with this or not is another question, it's an open question, but that any effort at, say, a philosophy of religion or a Christian apologetics that tries to prove the existence of God, or even more, tries to provide rational evidences for biblical revelation or the basic truths of Christianity and so on, all of that actually destroys the basis for faith, because its effort is to replace faith with knowledge. In another work, a work that came out under Kierkegaard's own name from the second authorship, I think it's from Christian Discourses, it may be from Works of Love, I'm not sure I remember which at this point it's from. Kierkegaard says this: the effort of apologetic reasoning is to give to the hungry monster of doubt the food which it likes best. Now, pondering that's a very astute psychological observation. And I can testify to my own sort of youthful Christian faith, that, whenever doubtful, difficult questions arose, I consult the apologists, C.S. Lewis, whoever, and so on. And that would provide some assurance and so on. But it was never enough assurance, right? It's like giving to the hungry monster the food. The hungry monster always demands more. So it becomes a kind of, and this is what Kierkegaard is getting, a kind of addiction. Like an addiction to heroin or whatever. The more you have, the more rational assurances you have, the more you want, but it's never enough. Never enough to give you that final certainty. But it's not, certainty isn't the question. Authentic faith is living with uncertainty, living with risk. And does Kierkegaard have to remind us that that's life, that's existence in general? If Christianity is, as Kierkegaard puts it in a late work, an existence communication, a communication that fits our human condition hand in glove perfectly. Part of our human condition is risk, is uncertainty. Now, why that is and so on, we'll get to that a little bit in a moment, but I have to, and I know time is running short here, say something about passion. That word comes up frequently in the Climacus writings. And when I use the word passion, or when you hear or read the word passion, maybe the first thing you think of is sex, right? Sexual passion, and so on. That's one use of the word in Danish or in English. Or alternatively, and this is another usage, we might think of the passion of Christ, right? Which passion there means suffering, not the desire for sexual union, and so on. Well, I think Johannes Climacus is very astute in associating the Danish word for passion with both of those things. Both passion in the sense of sexual desire and passion in the sense of suffering. Passion, as Kierkegaard or Climacus uses it, does not mean some type of fugitive feeling that comes over us. The word passion also carries, in most languages, a connotation of passivity, and that's not what Kierkegaard means. The kind of infinite passion, existential passion he's talking about here, is something much more active than that. And although this isn't exactly in Kierkegaard, I think what he means is the kind of agony and ecstasy that's involved in the creative process. Bringing into being a work of art involves that kind of passion. It's interesting that Climacus associates passion with coming into existence. The coming into existence, obviously, of the human person, of course, through the act of procreation. Well, that's sexual passion, right? But also the coming into existence of, say, the authorship. Kierkegaard's authorship, which is a venture that's both poetical and philosophical, or the coming into existence of any work of art, or the coming into existence of any important project, right? The passion is an active concentration of volitional energy. It's not something passive. And so don't think that Kierkegaard and Climacus are reducing faith to a mere emotion. That's not what Kierkegaard is saying. Faith is associated with the bringing into existence of a new existence, a new being. Being born from above, as St. John puts it in his gospel. All right, now on to the paradox, a central theme of the Climacus writings. And here's where things really get profound, and we only have like 7 minutes here, but we'll do our best. I'll probably not get to the second authorship and what prompted the second authorship, but be that as it may, from concluding unscientific postscript, the word paradox, as Climacus uses it, does not mean logical contradiction. It means a tension that has been so heightened that you have something that the human understanding cannot get its mind around, but it's not a logical contradiction exactly. So I'm going to read this passage from the concluding postscript. Subjectivity is the truth. Again, he's talking there about the truth and that is accessed through a deeper center of the human person, a spiritual center, deeper than the intellect. By virtue of the relationship subsisting between the eternal essential truth and the existing individual, the paradox came into being. That's paradox in the first sense, so the tension between the eternal truth and you and I existing in time. That's the first sense of paradox. It's the second sense, we're going to get to in a second here, that's the more important. Let us now go further. Let us suppose that the eternal essential truth is itself a paradox. That's the second sense of paradox. That it's not a paradox for human beings in time and our mortal condition. It's not the extremity of paradox for human beings in time and our mortal condition to access eternal truth. That's a paradox. But the heightened paradox is the eternal truth is within itself a paradox. How does the paradox come into being? By putting the eternal essential truth into juxtaposition with existence. Hence, when we posit such a conjunction, the truth becomes a paradox. The eternal truth has come into being in time. This is the paradox. It's what Johannes Climacus elsewhere calls it the absolute paradox. If, in accordance with the determinations just set forth, the subject is prevented by sin from taking himself back into the eternal, that's religion A, recollecting the eternal from within. If sin puts the kibosh on that, now he, the individual, need not trouble himself about this. For now, according to this new paradox, the eternal essential truth is not behind him, but in front of him or beside him, through its being in existence or having existed. So that if the individual does not existentially lay hold of the truth, he will never lay hold of it. What now is the absurd? The absurd is another term for paradox here. What now is the absolute paradox? The absurd or absolute paradox is that the eternal truth has come into being in time, that God has come into being, has been born, has grown up, and so forth, has come into being precisely like any other individual human being, quite indistinguishable from other individuals. For every assumption of immediate recognizability is paganism and idolatry. So what is Climacus getting at there? He's getting at this higher kind of religion. Religion B supposes that The eternal truth is within itself a paradox because the eternal truth has come into being in time in the form of, and if we have time, we'll get to some further texts from Climacus, in the form of the suffering servant. We all know who that is. But before I get to that, I need to read on the divine incognito, and that's from a commentary I wrote for my students on this and other passages from Climacus's writings, particularly the philosophical fragments, because this poses the question that Kierkegaard and Climacus are raising here, a very unsettling question for which Johannes Climacus provides a poetic rationale, as he calls it, an answer, a kind of answer. But here's the question. In numerous texts where Kierkegaard meditates on the meaning of the incarnation, or the absolute paradox, as he puts it, he provides a unique perspective on the absence or hiddenness of God, which we late moderns tend to feel acutely, and which has become a major theme in recent philosophy of religion. Kierkegaard provides what one might call a poetic rationale for the unrecognizability of God in creation and in Jesus Christ. Several poignant questions orbit around this topic. If there is a God, why is this fact not more obvious? If Christianity is based on a true historical revelation of God, why is this truth seemingly so inaccessible, indeed so offensive? Why did God choose to reveal God's self in the form of a suffering servant, the absolute paradox, rather than by some more direct and accessible means? As the character Judas poses to Jesus in Andrew Lloyd Webber's Jesus Christ Superstar, why did you choose such a strange time and such a strange place for your incarnation? Of course, we could imagine it's an even stranger time and place now. So, but anyway, that's either here nor there. Why require risky faith rather than giving us objective certainty once and for all? Why the protracted struggle to believe, which Kierkegaard himself felt so strongly? Why does God hide his face? Well, the answer that Climacus elaborates to these unsettling questions, we don't probably have time to read. That's too bad, but you have it right in front of you. Take home your outline, and you will find the next few texts on the divine reduplication gives you Climacus's answer to that question. I think it will become very clear. It will be good Lenten reading as well, because the texts in question are profoundly moving. As you will see, I recommend quite strongly your doing that. But in the couple of minutes we have left, I'm going to end with the absolute paradox, the litany of the absolute paradox, which you have in your possession there. I can find my copy of it here somewhere. There we go. This will heighten your sensitivity to exactly what Climacus has in mind here by calling the incarnation the absolute paradox. This is something I composed to help my students understand what Climacus is all about here. You have two columns, God in eternity and the God in time. That is Climacus's language for the incarnate God. Every proposition on the left-hand side is true, and every proposition on the right-hand side is true or could be true. And yet, to ponder the relation between the propositions on the left and on the right magnifies the reason why we can't get our heads around the incarnation and why faith in Jesus Christ is risky. And yet this paradox is impeccably orthodox. It reflects traditional Orthodox Christology, the two natures of Christ united in one person. Okay, so if we had time, I'd call someone up to be the God in time. We don't have time for that. Usually when I taught this in a class, it would be a litany, and the students would read the God in time, and I would read God in eternity. But we don't have time for that. So God in eternity, God is, God in time, God becomes. Yeah, right? Jesus was in time. He wasn't a phantom deity. God dwells in unapproachable majesty. God has nowhere to lay his head. God hits his thumb with a hammer in the carpenter's shop in Nazareth. God has a zit on the end of his nose. Is that blasphemous? Not if Jesus really is God in the flesh. God as a full and fully human person. God dwells in ineffable glory. God was born in a stable. God is omnipresent. God lives down the street in the local carpenter's shop. All things depend on God for their existence. God receives nourishment at his mother's breast. God is omniscient, all-knowing. God doesn't know the hour of his return. God loves impartially. The beloved disciple reclines on God's breast. God is impassible, has no passions or emotions. God weeps at the tomb of his friend. God is immaterial. God bleeds. He bled on the cross. God is omnipotent. God stumbles and falls under the weight of his cross. God is indivisibly one. God's side was riven with a spear. God's freedom is unconstrained. God becomes the servant of all. God is infinite. God is enclosed within the womb of his mother. God is the judge of heaven and earth. God appears before the judgment seat of the Roman procurator. God punishes the evildoer. God is punished as if an evildoer. God is beyond distinctions of race and ethnicity. God is a Jew. God is the eternal word. God speaks Aramaic. God is absolute being. God was born under the law. God is beyond distinctions of sex and gender. God was circumcised on the 8th day. God is infinitely wise. God preaches foolishness, at least according to St. Paul. God is eternal. God is late at arriving in Jairus' house. God gives the law to Moses as an everlasting covenant. God picks grain on the Sabbath in defiance of the law. God is eternally blessed. God is the accursed. Cursed is anyone who hangs upon a tree. God is impeccable, that is, without sin. God made himself to be sin for our sakes, according to St. Paul, right? God is infinite perfection. God thirsts. God is supreme beauty. God's face was disfigured. God is everlasting life. God is dead. Can God die? Well, there's the absolute paradox. In one sense, God did die on Good Friday. In one sense, God cannot die. So, you have here the question. The answer, or an answer, is given in the text that I hope you can read. Please feel free to take everything that I provided for you today. Thank you very much. We'll see you in church.